Welcome everyone to 4 at 4 Forums. We are coming to you live on Facebook and live on YouTube. Today's program is starring guest host Laura Moreno-Lucas. And now, here's Laura.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for the warm introduction. Hello and welcome everyone to the 4 at 4 Forum. Today, my name is Laura Moreno-Lucas and I'm proud to host today's incredible panel. Today, we're also proud to announce that California Lutheran University School of Management is our presenting sponsor. Learn more at callutheran.edu. On today's show, we'll have conversations with leading experts on corporate social responsibility, or CSR, and environmental social governance, or ESG. Definitely a mouthful. Specifically, we'll be talking about how CSR and ESG impact your valuations. But before we get started, let me share a little bit about what ESG is. ESG stands for, as I mentioned, environmental, social, and governance. Criteria are set standards for companies and operations that socially conscious investors use to screen potential investments. So now let's get to the panel. All right, so we'll start off with Elaine. Elaine, can you give us a little bit of background on your role and your Director of Sustainability Integration role and what you do today?
Sure, great. Thanks for having me. Yeah, I'm Elaine Selesky. I'm the Director of Sustainability Integration at Takeda Pharmaceuticals. We're an R&D-driven global biopharmaceutical company founded in Japan in 1781, and we're in about 80 countries. So I have a degree in journalism and an MBA in international business. And my background has been in marketing and public relations and agency and associations. And then I joined Baxter almost 15 years ago, leading sustainability communications, which we can talk about, but sustainability is also another word people often use for ESG or CSR. And back then they asked me to work on sustainability reporting. And 15 years ago, I didn't even know what that was. And now it's more commonplace. From there, I went with the biotech spinoff, Baxalta, off of Baxter, where I stood up the sustainability program, which then got acquired by Shire. And then Shire was then acquired by Takeda, where I am today.
Thank you, Elaine. Now moving on to Ivan. Ivan, can you share a little bit about your journey and where you are today?
Sure thing, Laura. Thanks for having me on the show. Currently, I'm a senior director at Inspire Group. We're an investor relations consultancy for emerging growth companies. I have 25 years of investor relations experience, so I've faced off with institutional investors, both while I was on the corporate side and currently as an advisor and in past advisory roles. I came to Inspire from Stockholm-based Skanska, which is a mid-cap commercial real estate and construction company, where I was vice president of investor relations. And prior to that, I spent some time at the New York Stock Exchange, where you and I would have been competitors because I believe you were at NASDAQ at the time. And prior to the Stock Exchange, where, by the way, I was also the representative to the UN Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative. And prior to the NYSE, I spent 10 years in the corporate investment bank of JP Morgan.
Yes, we would have definitely been rivals, but I know we would have got along. Well, thanks for sharing your colorful background. Now moving on to Bonnie.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Nixon, and I'll maybe start with how I started in this field. I've actually, interestingly enough, been doing environmental protection and social justice, environmental justice is what we call it, for about 43 years now. I've worn many different lenses. I began my career, I was going to Penn State, and I was pre-law, and I don't know how many of you may have remembered that 3 Mile Island happened there. It was the nuclear power plant leak. And that sort of was a big wake-up call for me. I became an NGO and active in nuclear waste and nuclear power. And then I moved to Amsterdam to study green plans and came back, and I was the head of PR for the Boston Harbor Cleanup Project. From there, I moved to San Francisco and started an environmental planning and communications consultancy called Circle Point. And I actually got to work on a lot of very large scale water, wastewater, transportation, utilities, hazardous waste, those types of things, until Hewlett Packard knocked on my door, and that was in 1997. And I began their social and environmental responsibility program for their $50 billion supply chain. So I did that for about 13 years until I went to the Walmart-led consortium of about 100 companies, where we were looking at life cycle assessments from Walmart to Mattel, to work on toys. And since then, I've been doing some interesting consulting, and I'm a professor at UCLA and Harvard in sustainable supply chain.
Wow, thank you, Bonnie. And I mean, so, nobody would have thought it's been around 13 years since a lot of these efforts have been going on. But as we see today, they're just now starting to really take hold. So thanks for sharing that with us. All right, so what I'd like to do is just really go around and ask you guys a few questions. We'll start with Elaine. Elaine, can you give us your thoughts on ESG today?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's been since I started in the field about 15 years ago. So much has changed, and I'd say in the past year, especially, the growth of ESG and the interest in ESG is growing. And when we talk about ESG, some people call it sustainability, some call it responsibility, some call it impact, some call it social impact, some call it CSR, corporate social responsibility. It almost doesn't matter what you call it. We're all talking about the same thing, more or less, which is how businesses can create long-term stakeholder value by focusing on other things than your hard financials, your ethics, your social, your environmental, your cultural, and these dimensions of doing business. And we've seen the interest most recently in the growth it has been fascinating. I think companies are using it or can use it as a differentiator with their employees or with investors. ESG can help manage risk, helps companies even build their business and reputation. Companies, I think, are seeing benefits to it. Investors are seeing benefits to it. Employees are seeing benefits to it. So there's definitely a lot of growth right now.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. Bonnie, can you talk a little bit about the evolution of ESG as well and some of the major trends that are affecting the space?
Sure. Like just as Elaine says, we've packaged it and called it a lot of different things over the last years, and I will specifically say that when I think about ESG, it stands for environmental, social, and governance. So it's how we address our environmental products and processes, our water, waste, energy, not just at our facilities and in our operations, but also in our products. It's the social, which is the humanity, the community, the individual, how we treat our workers. And then the governance, the leadership, and what is the structure to manage this and do this. And so really ESG is about how corporations respond to climate change, how they treat their workers, how they foster trust and innovation, and how they manage their supply chains. And that's one of the areas that I've dealt with. And I should just say, in terms of the evolution, Elaine, this really dates back. I mean, Rachel Carson was one of the first leaders. In 1962, she wrote a book called Silent Spring, and she only died a couple of years later, but she was a real pioneer because she was working, she was a marine biologist and looking at the impacts to the ocean, and over time saw the chemical pesticides impact, and specifically DDT. And she really led the charge, and it really dates back to then. And we'll get to talk about some of the frameworks that have evolved since then. But today, we owe a lot of debt to her for the original environmental movement dating back in '62.
Yeah, it's so important for companies. Again, it's all about just, quite frankly, being ethical. Thanks, Bonnie. All right, moving on to Ivan. Ivan, you bring us an interesting perspective to ESG from an investor standpoint. Why is ESG important to investors?
Well, more and more clients of institutional investors are demanding that their money be invested with companies that are environmentally responsible, socially responsible, and that have sound corporate governance as well, hence the term ESG. This is a very strong trend and one that will accelerate even more as millennials earn and invest more in the coming years. Women are also strong drivers of this investment trend. So the institutions that are managing their money, such as pension funds, mutual funds, among other asset managers, are increasingly focused on the ESG performance of the companies they consider for their clients' investment portfolios. They're looking at a lot of the things that both Elaine and Bonnie have already mentioned. And already nearly 50% of all assets under management globally have ESG mandates of one kind or another, with impact investing and sustainability themed investing growing the fastest in this category.
Wow. So Ivan, can you tell us a little bit more? How does somebody get started? How does a company get started to address ESG?
Well, okay. Well, to succeed, we recommend formulating a robust ESG strategy based on a thorough materiality assessment, which is an entirely subject in its own right. Make clear how your ESG strategy fits within your overarching corporate strategy, and keep investors apprised of your company's progress against your ESG strategy over time. That requires robust disclosure of ESG metrics and related information, ideally on an annual basis, so that investors can measure and assess your progress.
Thanks, Ivan. Bonnie, what do you think companies need to do to get started on this front?
I think companies are faced with three very powerful trends these days, and I have to give a shout out to, I work with sustainable brands these days, and a colleague of mine, Demeter, came up with the term revolutions, and it was like an R evolution, how we're evolving. And it's been an interesting couple of years, particularly with COVID, and I'm sure we'll talk about that. But investors really are beginning to look at capital markets to understand how companies are affecting the environment, how they're looking at topics like restoration, resilience, regeneration. What are changing notions of risk and return? What kinds of new financial instruments? We have something called the TC, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCRFD, and Dow Jones Sustainability Index, many rating systems that companies are subjected to. So they really need to look internally, at inside their own companies, at are they doing integrated reports? How are they treating employees? How are they managing their supply chain? How do they make decisions? How are they assessing transformative ways to develop their products, and really disclose and report on those. And then externally, I think companies are being forced to think about the macro issues and some of the new way we address social issues in the community and humanity. I mean, just the racial justice issues that have come up recently are really forcing companies to reflect and take a look at who are we as a company. It's kind of like what you said, Laura. It's how we operate ethically, and who are we, and how do we change the way we act and do things more responsibly.
Yeah, and I'm glad to see that more companies are coming and sharing their thoughts around that, because I think that that's the first step, right? That transparency. Elaine, can you share a little bit of your thoughts around this? What some of the first steps are that companies should consider to address ESG?
Sure. Yeah. And, I've done this at quite a few companies. It's, knowing what's expected of you and what's being said about you, and knowing what the bar is and trying to stay ahead of it when you compare yourself to other companies. And when we talk about being an ethical company, something about sustainability and ESG is kind of the soul of your company. What's your purpose? Identifying what that purpose is, aside from the financials, creating a strategy that will help build trust internally and externally. It really helps to unify a company. And then from there, it's the materiality assessment, figuring out as a company what's really important to you, where you might be lagging, setting goals, engaging with the ESG ratings and rankings. We had mentioned Dow Jones, there's MSCI, there's so many of them. But starting to talk with them and figuring out what they need, which is mostly publicly available information. And it becomes a whole process that tends to snowball.
Thanks, Elaine. This is such great intel, and thanks for all the good information, everybody. We're going to take a quick, short break for some music. Our music director, Paul Piazza, is going to introduce our guest today. Take it away, Paul.
Thanks, Laura. Yoshika Masuda is an accomplished cellist, having won a number of prestigious international competitions and just been appointed as cellist of the Ralston String Quartet. And more locally, many of us would know him because he's been instrumental in building a growing string studies program as the director and conducting of the very fine orchestra at Cal Lutheran University. He's one of the very bright emerging talents we have here in Southern California, although he's located in Canada at the moment, and he's going to be playing from there. And it's my pleasure right now to introduce Yoshika Masuda, who's going to be performing the prelude from Johann Sebastian Bach's Cello Suite in G major. Take it away, Yoshi.
Wow, thank you so much, Yoshi. That was amazing. I actually had that played at my wedding. That was great. Thank you so much. All right, so we're back with our panelists now for a little bit more deep dive on ESG. So let's talk with Elaine and Bonnie. Why is it important for companies to communicate? What is it important for their companies to communicate about their ESG activities, and why is it?
Sure, I can go first if you'd like. There's a lot of reasons, but it really helps to demonstrate your performance, which is what we've discussed investors are looking for, and to help build reputation, which is often what potential employees, your current employees, are looking for, as well as companies that you might work with or might hire you. So it helps to communicate with a strategy, with goals to show that you are working to progress. And then having stories about how you operate responsibly and you're addressing your environmental impacts. You're promoting employee welfare. You're being a good corporate citizen. I mean, it really helps to build loyalty to your company, trust, and an affinity. You know, I would mention being the soul of the company. It really gives your company a personality. And overall, there's an expectation, especially now and more recently, that a company is accountable for all its impacts and is transparent about them. So communication is key to meet that expectation.
Thanks, Elaine. Bonnie?
Yeah, I really want to pick up on the last comment that Elaine made about transparency. I think that, you know, increasingly companies are seeing that there are more and more risks out there, and risks that they can't necessarily and always control. You know, if you think about these complex supply chains and you look at even more recently what happened during COVID, you know, it was like, can we get masks? Can we get respirators? Can we get rubber gloves? Where are we getting them from? You know, and we get to see that how interdependent we are across the globe and how many people make each and every product that we use every day. And companies also are at the forefront of having to communicate, you know, how they're delivering and what risks they're facing. And I think that's what the ESG space has really brought to bear is we have this thing called integrated reporting. And only a few years ago, companies, you know, they started doing all sorts of reports and sharing, as Elaine said, hey, let's put a good story up there of something we're doing, an initiative we're doing in India or something we're doing in China. But then the community and stakeholders started to ask for, how are you integrating that in with your financials? And how are you minimizing your risks if there's an earthquake or a tsunami in Thailand, you know, and if there's a nuclear power plant leak in Japan? And, you know, and so global risk management within companies have always looked at this type of thing. But now, as we really increasingly see that interdependence, it, you know, it means that we have to shine light into sometimes some pretty dark places. And I'm going to be the first to tell you, you know, that at a certain point in time when we were working on electronics, or you look at rechargeable batteries for our, you know, the phone we use every day, the computer we're on, the electric car we may be driving. Well, in that rechargeable battery is coltan and what we call 3TG, and that comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And it's not, there's no real rule of law there. And you see 3- and 4-year-old kids that are mining and, you know, a lot of illegal activities. And so we have to get smarter and get more transparent about where we are in the world, the impacts that we're having on communities, on humanity, on societies, and how the global north can really help benefit the global south a lot more today.
Yeah, that's such an important point, and seeing how everything is intertwined, and also, you know, understanding the transparency there. Because once we start to get a better understanding of how everything's interconnected, then you start thinking through, well, you know, should we be viewing things this way? And I think ESG, like you mentioned, is definitely shedding a light on that. And you touched on the financial aspect. So I'm going to move to Ivan. Ivan, what's the bearing does ESG have on companies' financial strategies?
Well, that's a good question, Laura. It has a strong correlation with the company's cost of capital. Because investment capital is increasingly being directed at companies that have strong ESG performance, companies that don't perform well in this regard will see a drop in demand for their shares or their debt. That means they'll end up raising capital at an unfavorable price in the case of equity offerings, or with higher interest rates in the case of debt offerings. And with regard to bonds, a recent Merrill Lynch study found that the cost of debt for companies with high ESG ratings was a full 2 percentage points lower than for companies with poor ESG ratings. So you can see how being a good ESG performer can actually benefit your company financially and with regard to its overall financial strategy. And if you're a strong ESG performer, you're more likely to have a rich market valuation, and interest expenses will eat up less of your operating profits, just to illustrate that point. And to expand on it, today Citibank announced that it will measure what level of carbon emissions are associated with its loans. And if I've been clear, everyone can infer from this news that companies that want to borrow from Citibank will likely end up paying higher interest rates if their carbon performance is subpar. In other words, good ESG lowers your company's cost of capital, which is really the most important goal of a financial strategy.
Yep, hitting the bottom line there. And what are your thoughts around this year, particularly how COVID has impacted this sector of the market with with defining the ESG investing, and in a positive or negative way?
Sure. Well, at Inspire Group, we have both companies that have benefited from it in ways that we hadn't expected, and others that have, like many companies, have suffered. But I think what's important here is, and Bonnie and Elaine touched upon this, investors really want to understand better what the risks are in the current environment and looking ahead, and how management is managing those risks. At the end of the day, investors, when they assign a value to your, whether it's your stock or your debt, a big part of that, big component of that is risk and understanding the risk. So that's really been really top of mind with investors in this environment. And in addition, of course, to understanding how companies are protecting their employees, their suppliers, and the other participants or the other companies that make up their supply chain, and that's a way of helping them get a good grasp of the risk and how well management is addressing that risk.
Thank you. Elaine, you want to share your thoughts on that, on how COVID has impacted things for you?
Yeah, I had mentioned when we talk about ESG, it's that long-term view. Companies set goals 5, 10, 20, 30 years out, which is a different way of thinking than when we set financial goals as a company. And I think COVID has shined a light on long-term thinking and long-term risks, these non-financial risks, and how a company is prepared for things that can happen, like a global pandemic. How resilient is that company? What their contingency planning has been like. Is it working? And also how they're treating their employees, what kind of benefits, and different things that they're allowing employees to do during COVID. So it's definitely shined a light, I think, in a different way on the long-term performance and some of these non-financial risks that maybe weren't as always looked at.
Yeah. Bonnie, what's your take on this? What are you seeing on your end? with how COVID has changed the perception of ESG?
You know, I think there's a positive angle and a challenging or a negative angle, or one where there's a lot of opportunities. I mean, the positive is that, you know, I think in talking, I've been brought up the term materiality. And when we do a materiality analysis within a company or of a company, we're looking at what's most relevant. What are your highest priorities? So, you know, if you're involved in metals, then mining is your issue. I want to bring up, there's a framework called the natural step that actually dates back to 1989 in Sweden by a gentleman by the name of Karl Heiner Robert. And they came up with a very simple framework. And that's what I love about the environmental spaces. We have a lot of really simple, comprehensive, well thought out tools and frameworks that we can use as we move into this next decade and try and determine how to measure things. But the natural step looked at, you know, how much are we mining into the ground? How much are we emitting out into the environment in the air, causing the ozone depletion? What are we bioaccumulating with non-biodegradable waste, such as plastics and cement and things that don't break down? And finally, how much are we affecting photosynthesis, or what is considered the only naturally regenerative process on the planet, you know, that forestry brings and trees bring and photosynthesis. So when you look at some of these frameworks, I mean, they provide an opportunity for us to look at what's important to us, what's most important, and what are our priorities. And COVID, I think, really forced people, even in their own households, to say, what's important? Do I need all this stuff? You know, there's this woman named Annie Lenny does this program called The Story of Stuff, and I would highly recommend people look at that, because it just walks through very simply all of the things that we think we need, that we're addicted to in production and consumption. And we are addicted to consumption. And, you know, so COVID really like forced us to start asking, do we need all these things? And prioritize. And I think that I do want to say the challenging aspect of this is that when people stop traveling, you know, when you're in complex supply chains and you're affecting things all over the world, we saw compliance take a back seat. We saw auditing go down. We saw, you know, not as much attention. I mean, supply chains are complex, and really, if you want to manage them, the bottom line is you've got to have feet on the street. You've got to be there physically and look at what's happening. And I think COVID is a challenge in terms of that. And we started making exceptions, and it was like okay to have one single-use plastics again, and okay to have millions of pairs of rubber gloves and plastics, and you know, and we all want masks, but we want to do these things responsibly. We've learned a lot of lessons, and there are some, I just want to say, incredible frameworks that exist out there, from cradle to biomimicry to natural step to, you know, just beautiful frameworks that provide guidance on how we can rethink this incredible place and how we use it.
That's wonderful. That I love that, you know, how to rethink things, right? Because I think that's what COVID has obviously put into play here. How do we rethink how we are all living and
reimagine, redesign? Yep.
Yeah. And so, Elaine, what kind of, you know, stakeholders are looking for this ESG information? Like who do you think needs this?
Certainly investors, and we're hearing that loud and clear.
Mm-hmm.
Often sustainability reports are read by employees and potential employees because it tends to provide kind of an under the hood look at how a company is operating and managing some of these issues like Bonnie was mentioning. So certainly investors, employees, companies who want to do business with you are often read these sustainability reports and are a major stakeholder. NGOs are certainly reading and watching companies to see what's being disclosed, and either to partner together or, you know, to criticize. You know, so there's a double-edged sword to reporting, but again, it is expected by, I would say, almost every stakeholder is interested in what you're doing for the environment, what you're doing for your community, in one way or another.
Thank you. All right, well, we're going to take another break here from this discussion. We're going to go back to Yoshi for some more music. Excuse me, and we're happy to have the show sponsored, as mentioned, by Cal Lutheran University. Can you tell us a little bit more of the recent progress of the arts at CLU and some upcoming plans for the fall?
Sure. You guys were all talking about reimagining this new norm, and certainly that's a very challenging task for any music programs at any level, honestly. And certainly it's been a challenge to try and keep not only the motivation but the progress for the students during this time. But one great thing about CLU is the fact that it is a very tight-knit community, and people do come together in times of need. And this certainly has proven that once again. And so faculty and students are now coming together, even though we have gone virtual for the entire semester. The students are really trying their best, and we are definitely doing more than what we need to do usually in order to make this learning experience a worthwhile thing for the students. So we've provided kids with mics in order to have a better learning experience via Zoom for their lessons, and some virtual performances and so forth. So it's still a very exciting time for us.
Yeah, that's fascinating to hear the unity behind how you guys are coming together. Well, what do you have for us? What do you have planned now for your
So
piece?
actually, I thought to add some variety. I wanted to share a performance I did actually at Cal Lutheran in their beautiful Samuelson Chapel just only a few months ago. It's a beautiful piece by this composer Maria von Paradis, and it's called Sicilienne. I hope you enjoy it.
Wonderful. That was beautiful, beautiful. Thank you, everybody. All right, so now we're back with our panelists for some final thoughts while we get set to wrap up here. So I'll start with Bonnie. Why don't you share a little bit of what you'd like to leave everyone with on ESG?
Sure. Thanks so much for this opportunity and with this esteemed panel. When I think about ESG, as I've shared, I think a lot about the history. I remember that there was a book back many years ago in the late 1990s called Natural Capitalism, which really sought to factor in, how could we include externalities into accounting principles. And more recently, Kate Raworth has come up with this concept of donut economics, and which really looks at a new GDP where we can include health and freedom and equity. And I think if we think about the principles of responsible investment, I mean, we're talking about $20 trillion to $70 trillion of invested capital. And how we think of that is really important. And I'm excited about the next decade because I think that companies, societies, communities, governments are beginning to recognize the importance of working together so that we could expand the way we measure well-being and create a new pathway to prosperity. Not look at GDP in the traditional Milton Friedman-esque way and really start to see how are we going to protect this incredible planet that we have, this incredible playground. I mean, the natural step does say one thing, sourcing back, it says, the planet's actually going to be just fine with or without us. If we disappear, the planet may explode back into a gaseous ball of flames like it started, and it won't be very emotional about that. But the bottom line is we won't be here. People won't be here to enjoy it. And I think that every year we see this, it's a global footprint, and we see us overshoot ourselves, and we're operating in a deficit. In August now, we have actually used up all the resources of the planet for the year, and we're on negative. It's like a red in our bank account from here on in. And we need to really start thinking about regeneration and restoration and resilience in different ways. And I think this, talking to the CFOs, talking to the investment community, talking to the money magnets is going to be one of the places to create that new pathway to prosperity. So I'm excited about what's to come from someone who's been doing this for 43 years. I never get tired. It's about purpose for me, and I will never get tired. I'll be here doing this until I'm well over 100.
Bonnie, you're keeping me hopeful here. Ivan, and so on the financial and capital side, what do you think? What do you want to leave people with on the ESG front?
Well, it's really hard to follow Yoshika and Bonnie here, but my parting thoughts would be that ESG is a path well worth taking, and that companies financially, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier, would find it very rewarding in terms of having greater access to capital. Whether it's in the public equity markets or the private equity markets, such as venture capital, and raising capital on more favorable terms. So, encourage folks out there that are, at the helm of companies to have that in mind. And again, I think you'll find it a rewarding experience, and encourage you to follow that path for reasons that I've mentioned and Bonnie and Elaine have mentioned.
Thank you.
Oh, one other thing, if you'd like to learn more about I was a bit wonky, so I thought during my remarks. But if you'd like to learn more about how ESG benefits a financial strategy, we have published a number of blogs on this subject on our website, which is inspiregroup.com.
Thank you. Elaine, final thoughts?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, and that's a great point that this is a community of people who are very open to collaborating and sharing. I think that's one thing I love about working in the sustainability space. And in talking with investors through the years, we've heard it's not expected for companies to have it all figured out. We've talked about a lot today. What's expected is that companies show that they're on a journey to disclose and be transparent about their challenges and their risks, because it shows transparency. So I think wherever a company is in this journey, there's room and there are people who are willing to support. And I know everyone on this call would be willing to help if anyone is looking for advice.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for being here. Please join us next Thursday and every Thursday at 4 at 4. You can see our upcoming programs at our website at peoplemedia.live. That's www.peoplemedia.live. Next week, we are pleased to welcome a great panel on CBD, cannabis, and cannabis. And finally, it's Hispanic Heritage Month, and you can join our 1-hour live celebration on September 14th on pandocap.co. And here's a little taste for you. Thank you, everybody.
Hey, Laura, you can't end us too early because I got to talk about the music that's coming up.
Oh, I'm
next
so
week.
sorry.
That's okay. Plus, we got to hear from Yoshi one more time. He's going to play us out. It's going to be fantastic. Next week, we have Andrew Kelsey coming on the show, jazz guitarist, singer, songwriter. He's going to give us a really great groovy groove for next week's show. It's going to be a lot of fun. Just wanted to let everybody know we love bringing live local acts, bands, individual musicians on to be featured on this show. So if you have a local band or a musician that you would like to suggest be featured on 4 at 4 Forums, we would love to hear about it. So please visit our Facebook page, 4 at 4 Forums. You can send us a message and we would love to get in touch with whatever musicians you want to recommend for the show. And then finally, as you probably are aware, everybody, the age of COVID has been a tough one for musicians throughout Southern California. So if you want to support the live artists that you hear on this show and that we feature on future shows, please visit peoplemedia.live and donate to our Musicians Fund to make sure that great, high-quality live music is available to all of us, whether it's online or whenever we can meet in person again. So with that all being said, I'm going to bring back on board one more time Yoshika Masuda, the fantastic cellist and director of string studies at Cal Lutheran University, to play us out for the show. Thank you all so much for being here today. Yoshi, we have on tap some more Bach, the Courant and Allemand from the cello suite, and we can't wait to hear it. Thank you so much.